Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello, and welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast about creative business, self-employment, and making money online without social media. I'm Amelia Fruby. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this show, where I share stories, strategies, and experiments for running a successful, sustainable small business with radical generosity and energetic sovereignty. You are currently listening to season 5 of the podcast, which is all about your 2025 marketing toolkit, by which I mean the 3 marketing strategies that I think and hope and believe will be supportive, sustainable, and successful for you and your business in 2025. And today, the strategy that we are talking about is podcast guesting. To do that, I am joined by the one, the only, dear friend, business collaborator, business partner of mine, Taylor Elyse Morrison. Taylor has been on the podcast at least 2 other times. I believe this is her 3rd appearance or 3rd official appearance on the show. She also had a Clubhouse appearance last year that I loved. But just in case Taylor is new to you, let me introduce her before we dive in. Taylor Elyse Morrison is a portfolio careerist asking the question, how can we experience well-being and fulfillment in every aspect of our lives? She's the founder of the Inner Workout app and the award-winning author of a book by the same name. Named one of Fortune's 10 innovators shaping the future of health, Taylor is tired of aspirational wellness as usual. Instead, she makes personal development more accessible. Taylor uses her coaching, mindfulness, and movement training to meet people where they are and get them closer to what they really want. Hi, Taylor. Welcome to Off the Grid.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here and to be back.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled to have you back. When I had you on the Clubhouse last fall, I was like, I can't go a year without having you on my podcast. We have to rectify this immediately. So I'm happy to be kicking off 2025 with you here on the public feed.
Yeah, me too.
Today's conversation feels a little meta to me because we are talking about podcast guesting in the context of you being a guest on my podcast. And I feel like we're really going to be kind of like winding in and through that together. But before we go too deep, I want to ask you a very basic question for the beginners out there whom I love. And that question is, what is podcast guesting?
Yes, I love this question. And podcast guesting simply means that you are being a guest on other people's podcasts as a part of your marketing strategy. So it's a really intentional approach to being on other people's podcasts with the goal of building relationships, growing your expertise, and expanding your reach.
I love this. You have already given us so much. And I just want to highlight that for some people, you may have been doing podcast guesting without like making it an intentional part of your marketing strategy. I also just want to say that sometimes I hear some confusion for people between like, is podcast guesting about being a guest on podcasts or having guests on my podcast? And I think that for us, we are talking about the former. We're talking about being a guest on other people's podcasts. But for some people, having their own podcast might actually be a better starting point for them. So could we talk a little bit about like, how do you know if you should start a podcast or focus on podcast guesting?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And it's one I'd love to explore in real time with you. I have been on both sides of this. So I started podcasting a little bit later than you in 2019. And even though that was only 6 years ago, it was different. Like I started a podcast and I didn't expect for people to start viewing me as an authority on a subject, but pretty quickly, just the fact that I had this podcast changed the way people engaged with me and my work. So it was really me focused. It was me trying to share my frameworks and build this authority and expertise and deeper relationship with my audience. When I'm on other people's podcasts, I'm still leaning into those things that I've developed, But my thought is I want to connect with people who I do not already know. And that's the distinction in my mind, but I want to know what the distinction is for you.
Yeah, I love this distinction so much. And it's also reminding me that your podcast was the first podcast I was ever a guest on. And that was almost exactly 6 years ago. It was January 2019, which is wild to think about right now. I had not put that together in this sort of like meta podcast soup that we're swimming in. But you started B School and I was the first guest you had on. And that was the first time I was ever a guest on a podcast. And look at us now. So I'm just loving this little nostalgic memory moment that I'm having for myself. I think that in terms of should I start a podcast or should I focus on podcast guesting? For me, one of the biggest considerations is have you built a body of work that is easily like shareable with other people? Because I think that I will often receive podcast pitches from people where I'm like, you don't have blog posts or a book or, a portfolio where I can really see like, whoa, here is your story. Here is what you do. Here is what we can talk about. Like I need someone who wants to be a guest on my podcast to kind of like hand me like something that'll spark my interest. And I think that if you're somebody who's thinking to yourself, like, I love being in conversation, I want to be a guest on other people's podcasts, but you don't yet have your own body of work, I think starting a podcast can be a great way to use those conversational skills and sort of build your body of work and be sharing it in the world. So that feels related to what you said to me, but it's just been coming up a lot lately in conversations I've been having. I think the other thing is that starting a podcast is a really great way to build a network. It's a great way to invite people onto your show that maybe are little like aspirational partners for you, right? Like people who are like, I love your work. I'd love to have a reason to be in conversation with you. And you can invite them onto your podcast and have that conversation. And I think that's a great reason, especially if you're just starting out and you don't have a sort of network of business peers and collaborators and partners. Starting a podcast and like investing in that can be a great way to get to know people and to build that network of connections. I think once you have your podcast up and going and you have your network, like what podcasts do best is nurture relationships. But if you're just getting started and you don't have a platform and you don't really have a body of work yet, I think starting a podcast may be where I would begin before I just start pitching myself out to other shows.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And when I think about B School, which was the first podcast that I hosted on my own, a lot of it was me figuring out my perspective, my point of view. It started as solo and then went into having interviews. And the piece that I'm sitting with of podcast guesting versus having your own podcast, I think in general, it's just having really realistic expectations overall. And I think for both starting a podcast and for podcast guesting, it's really easy for people to think that this is the panacea that is going to fix everything. And for both strategies, whichever one makes more sense for you, it's going to be rolling up your sleeves and testing and learning. So whatever path you go, just know that there's going to be experimentation involved.
Absolutely. I love that you're emphasizing that. And for me, what all of this comes back to is like, what do you really want to do? Like, if you have that seed in you that's like, I want to start a podcast, then I want to encourage you to start a podcast. Like, I think often when we're thinking about marketing strategies, we like go in our brain and we're like, what is the most strategic idea that's going to get me the best results? And I need to do that thing. But more often, I find that what takes us down the path we need to go on is following like our desires and impulses. So if you want to start a podcast, everyone's telling you, well, you should be podcast guesting. Like, you can trust yourself to start that podcast. Or if you're like, Amelia and Taylor, I never, ever want to start a podcast in a million years. Like, don't let what we just said convince you to do that. That's okay. You have a different path. And so I love this. Like, even though this whole series is about your 2025 marketing toolkit, I'm not promising you that using these tools is going to get you the exact result you have in mind. I don't know what that result is for the first thing. And also, like, it's about bringing a spirit of experimentation and an understanding of your desires, your needs, your metrics for success to that as well. So I think that's always a nice reminder before we dive into the details of a marketing strategy.
And these can be really complementary strategies as well. So it's not that you have to choose one or the other. Depending on your capacity, you might need to, but they also can work really well in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I don't have to focus on podcast guesting is because by having a podcast, I get a lot of guest invitations. So it just kind of happens for me as a part of the cycle of what I'm doing and sharing in the world. So yes, I love that reminder. It's never either or. You can do both or neither, whatever works for you. Okay, before we get into all of the practical, tactical details of podcast guesting, I want to talk about what podcast guesting is good for and what it's not good for in our businesses. So you wrote this amazing blog post that I will link to in the show notes so folks can just see it and grab this in the future if they need it. But I'm curious, Taylor, could you talk a little bit about what podcast guesting does well for us in our work and our businesses? And then we'll go into what it does not do well.
Absolutely. So if you think of the sales funnel or whatever metaphor you want to use for it, at the top of it is awareness. And that's what podcast guesting is really good for, is getting in front of other people's audiences and creating that moment where now they know who you are. And podcast guesting is so, so good for that because you're getting to have this conversation that people are sitting in on. And it's different than email. It's certainly different from a short form video collab where you're dancing together or doing whatever you might do. And it's building awareness. It's maybe a deeper awareness than you can get from other types of awareness building tactics. So that's one thing that I've personally experienced it being really, really good for. The other piece is for building credibility. I, at this point, have been on, I don't even know how many podcasts, definitely over 50 podcasts, most of which I'm talking about something related to self-care and well-being. And I do believe that that's one of the reasons that people know I have expertise in that area. Now, part of it, back to what you were saying on building a body of work, part of that is because I do have a book and I have been talking about some version of this topic since 2017. And then it's amplified because if you look me up, you can see me being on all of these podcasts. So I think it's a great credibility building thing. And I'm sitting in the seat as guest sharing my expertise and am immediately positioned as someone who's trustworthy on this topic. And then the last piece that I like to add that was accidental is it can be really great for SEO and for building backlinks. I was doing some look at my SEO on my personal website versus Inner Workout's website. And Inner Workout, I think, is double the domain authority. And I believe it's because when I'm on podcasts, mostly, and this is going to be changing in 2025, but for the most part, I've been linking to Inner Workout. And so it has all of these backlinks. And that's not something I expected. I also have an example of, for my own podcast, I linked to an affiliate link that I had, and I've made tens of thousands of dollars from that affiliate link because it got boosted through podcasting. That was my own podcasting, not podcast guesting. But I think people underestimate the value of being linked in the podcast relationship.
Yeah, I love all of these things that you just said. And just to recap for listeners, you said that podcast guesting is good for growing awareness about you and your work, helping people know who you are and what you talk about. It's good for building credibility, establishing that you are an expert and that you are trustworthy in this area. And then I love this kind of bonus that you gave us around boosting SEO. And I think that is really something to highlight because a lot of folks that I talk to and work with, and I know that listen to the show, they may not have really spent much time working on their personal website or their business site or building SEO there. But you can kind of inadvertently do that work if a bunch of people are backlinking to it. Even if you're not actively I am focused on SEO on my site this year, if other folks are linking to your site a lot, and some of them have great domain authority, as you mentioned, Taylor, because they have bigger sites where they've worked on SEO, that can actually boost your site in search engines as well. And I think that that's a nice bonus. And even though that is the case, podcast guesting is also not for everyone in every stage of business. So could you tell us, Taylor, what are a couple things like podcast guesting is not good for?
Yeah, podcast guesting is not good for immediate conversions. So if you are in a situation where you're like, I need money yesterday, there are much more tangible sales tactics that you should be approaching. It's much more of a long game. And so I'm not saying I have not had the experience of someone buying something immediately after hearing that I was a guest on a podcast, but that's always a nice to have situation. I never build out my podcast guesting assuming that they're going to immediately convert. But it's also not just about you. Podcast guesting is not about you. So if you just want to talk at someone and you're not willing to be in conversation both with the host, but also with their audience, it's not going to be a good strategy for you. And finally, it's not for building the plane while you're flying it. We've spoken about the importance of having a body of work or something that you've created that you feel ready to share. And while being a guest on podcasts might give you a new metaphor or a new way to talk about something that you've done, you already have done the work. You already have the thing to share. And I think you run the risk of losing credibility if you try to podcast guest too soon before you know what it is that you want to share with the world, what your POV is.
Yes. Thank you so much for highlighting that, because if you focus on podcast guesting too soon, you actually lose the credibility benefits of podcast guesting because the work that you've put out into the world, maybe now you're not agreeing with it, or you're saying something different, or people can't trust that you are the expert that you are being held up as and that you're holding yourself up as. So I really hear you on that. And I think that that's important. And also, sometimes if we feel a lot of fear around that, we just have to try it anyway, right? I feel like some people will need a podcast guesting pep talk. Like if you're not practiced sharing your voice in public, if it brings up a lot for you to step into that guest seat, all we can do is try it out and practice and see how it goes. Taylor, do you have any advice for that person who may be listening to this and feeling really tight in their chest and ugh, I don't know if I can be a podcast guest. Probably I'm never going to have the plane built, so I can't ever go on a podcast. What would you say to somebody feeling that way in this moment?
Yeah. Ooh, the first thing, take a deep breath.
I need a deep breath.
Clench your whole body and then unclench your whole body and do that a few times. And we've talked about being an expert and expertise. I really believe that expert is something that other people call you. So I never call myself an expert. Other people have called me an expert in self-care or whatever it might be. And so I would invite you to check in with yourself. How confident do I feel in my method, my approach, my perspective? And if you are, I don't know what percentage to put on top of it, but if you feel like I've been saying the same thing for a while, I might have some different nuances, but I'm not going to flip-flop tomorrow, you're ready. And I would just say, as someone who works with a lot of people in a one-on-one capacity, from people who have worked in corporate for 30 years all the way to people who are just starting to get their creative project off the ground, no one feels completely ready. So that's not the bar. The bar is, do I feel like I can talk about this and I feel in a certain amount of integrity with myself as I talk about this? You're still going to feel afraid. That's going to happen. And that's normal. You don't need to get rid of it. You can just let that fear, anxiety, nerves come along with you on the ride, but you are going to go on the ride of podcast guesting if you choose to.
Yes. Thank you for the pep talk. I feel like I needed that, even as someone who's been podcast guesting for such a long time. So I really appreciate it. Hi, Off the Grid listeners. Amelia here, interrupting our conversation today because I want to share with you one of my favorite marketing tools. When I left Instagram, I invited all of my followers to subscribe to my mailing list in order to keep in touch with me. And I promised to send them monthly-ish notes on a lot of the themes I used to talk about on social media. I've used many email service providers in my day, but my favorite of all of them is Flowdesk. Flowdesk is a gorgeous, easy-to-use email service provider. It helps you create beautiful, thoughtful emails, and even better, it's really set up to help you create easy-to-use landing pages so people can join your list, and workflows so you can automate sending messages to folks who sign up through different pages. Flowdesk is how I run all of the welcome sequences and lead magnets at Softer Sounds. It's also how I run the Leaving Social Media Toolkit that you might have downloaded after listening to this podcast. I'm surely not sending those emails out myself manually. Flowdesk is doing all of that auto-magically. If you'd like to give Flowdesk a try, please use my affiliate link below in the show notes. You'll get a discount, I'll get a kickback, and we will all send more beautiful emails together. Again, check out the affiliate link in the show notes. For now, we're going to get back to this episode of Off the Grid. Taylor, at this stage, if folks have listened to this and they're like, okay, I would like to try podcast guesting in 2025. I think this could be interesting and a way to grow my business, or it might be of benefit to my business and my work. What do you suggest they do first? Like, what's their next step or next couple of steps to get into podcast guesting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first piece, and I've been playing with this idea of specificity. It's something that I have resisted in many ways, and yet it is a gift and a balm for me. And so being specific about who you want to talk to when you're podcast guesting. You may have a really broad topic that could apply to a lot of people, but where do you think you can provide the most value? So start to be thinking about that piece. And then from there, you're going to, with that in mind, develop what podcast you're going to pitch. You're going to build out a pitch list. You're going to write a pitch to those specific podcasts. You're going to have a media kit. You're going to have topics that specifically speak to people's needs, problems, hopes, dreams. And so that's all the work that you're going to do in order to start podcast guesting. So it's not just about, hey, I have this podcast I listen to all the time. Let me just send them a quick note and see if I can be a guest on the show. There's a lot of thought that you want to do ahead of time.
Okay, what I heard you say there is that you need a couple things before you begin working on podcast guesting. So could you just real quick, I want to ask some more specifics, what is a media kit and what is a pitch list?
Yeah, so a media kit is something that gathers the information about you. So it probably has information about what you do, links to your body of work that Amelia was speaking to, and also oftentimes has your headshot, maybe has some other specific pieces that they might use for promotional assets. But it's this place that you can go to that says, here's what you need to know about Amelia and Amelia's work. So that's your media kit. And there are different versions of what that can look like. And then in terms of a pitch list, it is a targeted list. Again, I'm leaning into specificity for myself in 2025, a targeted list of the podcasts that you are most interested in being on as a guest. Because there's millions of podcasts. So you're going to do yourself a favor if you can get specific.
Okay, beautiful. So if I've got my media kit and I've got my pitch list, now we develop the pitch, if I understand your process correctly. What are a couple just high-level tips you would give for somebody who's writing their first pitch to be on podcasts?
Make it about the other person. That can be advice. That's just evergreen advice for relating to other humans.
Yeah.
It's easy to think that, okay, I am saying I want to be a guest on podcasts. So I need to make myself sound so important. And yes, there is an element of credibility building, but as someone who both is a guest on podcasts and is a podcaster, when I see pitches that are resonant, it's because they understand me and they understand who my audience is. And they're coming from a place of providing value rather than just boosting their ego. So it sounds like a simple mindset shift, but reading through what you've written to see how much am I talking about myself? How much am I relating it back to the podcast and the podcast audience? That's probably the biggest shift that can get you a quick win. The other thing is we all have email inboxes. We all know how wild it is in there.
Yeah.
So what can you do from a subject line perspective, from the way you format your email to make it easy for people to engage with you and make them want to know what is going to happen when they click into your email?
I would say I get a couple different types of pitches in my inbox. One pitch is the like, this person obviously wrote this with AI and has never listened to my podcast, and I'm immediately like deleting it or filing it away. Like, I'm not even going to respond to that type of pitch, right? And I'm assuming that nobody listening to this show or this episode right now is writing that kind of pitch, right? Like, you have listened to Taylor's advice, hopefully, dear listener, and selected the shows you're pitching to with specificity. You've thought about like, what do you have to offer them and their community? And you've like built the body of work that shows the podcast host like, and here's like my credibility. Like, here's how I back that up. It's not just that like I'm interested in talking about, whatever it might be. It's that I also have places that I've done that in the world that I can show you. And if people listen to it and they love it, I have ways they can go deeper with me around this. I think that's a really important thing for me with a good pitch as well. It's like, I appreciate when the person pitching me is thinking of my listeners and they're also thinking of like before, during, and after, right? Like, what have they done before this interview that is really like bringing all that experience and expertise into the interview that makes it so great? And then how can they support people coming out of it? Because sometimes I get pitches from people on something that's like tangential to what they do. And I'm like, this is great. But like, if somebody listens to us have an amazing conversation about, I don't know, SEO, but you don't actually support people with SEO, like they're going to want more support and I don't know where to send them. And so there's also this piece for me that's like the alignment of what you're pitching and what you do and how you help people in the world, like what you create in the world, that I think is really important for a good pitch. And when I go back to those like types of pitches I receive, there's the ones we politely delete from the inbox. There's the ones that like, I can tell they love my podcast, but they don't quite know how they would contribute to it. And then there's these others that really do see like they've done their work to get to where they are, which gives them something very specific to offer to my audience and a way to support them after. And that's really like the like pitch that I love to see. And I'm immediately like, let me reply to this and slot you in for a recording schedule, like a recording time, because we need this on the feed ASAP. I'm curious, as a podcaster yourself, I know that most of your shows are on hold right now, but you've been doing this for years and years and years. Like, what is red flag and a green flag for you when a pitch lands in your inbox? Like, could you give us an example of something where you're like, I hate to see this and I love to see that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I'm giggling because I include my middle name, Taylor Elyse Morrison, but if someone is just looking Taylor Morrison, I could be a lot of genders, ethnicities, etc. And so I get people who very clearly do not know who I am as a Black woman, which gets back to the piece of just having done a little bit of research. Like, have you listened to any of the podcasts? Have you even just looked through the feed to see the types of topics that I talk about? You can tell pretty quickly when someone is sending the exact same thing to everyone without even the teensiest bit of customization. So that's always a red flag. Like, this was actually a little bit different because someone was reaching out to me. It was still a pitch, but they were reaching out to me to be on a men's empowerment podcast, which, if you know anything about me, even you listeners, you may have only known me for 15, 20 minutes. Do I sound like the person who would want to be on a men's empowerment podcast? So zero research done is a big red flag for me. And then in terms of a green flag, it's when people say exactly what they can offer to my listener and it feels aligned. And I'll often see them weaving in, like for Inner Workouts podcast, Inner Warm Up, they know that I talk about self-care in a specific way. And so they might weave some of that into the pitch to show that there's alignment there, because there's a lot of ways to talk about health and wellness and well-being. And there's a lot of ways that I reject. So when you show me you have heard me and you're on the same page, it feels like a yes.
Like, I'm not going to show up in your inbox with a pitch on like 5 easy workouts to start 2025, right? Like, that's not the type of workout the Inner Workout is about. So I think I love this. Yeah, it's that sort of alignment, specificity, understanding. And like, there's something behind all of this that's just like, we create podcasts so that we can be heard. And in a good pitch, that person is showing that they heard us and they got it. And I think that often the pitches that for me are the red flags, sometimes I can't point to any specific thing about it that's a red flag, but the way it makes me feel is that they want something from me, not that they're offering something to me. And I can't give listeners like a perfect way to avoid that or like, and I also understand that some of this is transactional, but there's a way of just moving in this space that can feel really good for everybody involved. And then there's a way of operating in this space that just feels really extractive of the podcasters that you're reaching out to. And that doesn't feel good for anybody. Like, we don't want to do that. And I'm trusting everyone listening to this that you won't. Okay, so I feel like we've talked about the sort of things you need to create before you pitch. We've talked a little bit about like pitches we like to see in our inbox and maybe like don't like to see in our inbox. But what I've encountered is that for a lot of people, the hardest part of all of this is actually like that little bullet point list in the pitch of like what you might talk about. Because as a podcast host, typically that's like the first thing I'm looking at in a pitch. It's like I'm scanning until I get to that little list. And so there's a lot of pressure on it. And I want to acknowledge that. Like, it does have to sing for me as a host to say yes to those ideas. And also, it can feel hard to like summarize everything you do in 3 to 5 bullet points of things you might talk about. So I thought it could be fun for us to think about kind of a few imaginary-ish people and small business owners. And if we were them, what might we pitch to some podcasts? And maybe we even think of like specific shows we might pitch them to, or a type of show we might pitch and what we would say to that show. So join me in this Mr. Rogers imaginary moment. If we were a tarot card reader who loved to sell readings and occasionally did some workshops, and we're trying to grow our business in this year, 2025, where might we start with podcast guesting? Let's say our meeting gets done, but we're still trying to figure out pitch list and pitch topics. Taylor, what's a topic you might put on that list?
The first thing that came to mind is like, what has tarot done for you in your life? How is tarot useful for you? And I would start there because that gives you that personal credibility. And then maybe you would say, tarot has really reignited my creative practice. Okay, that gives me a sense of who you might pitch. Or tarot helped me pivot in my career. Or I've been using tarot to change the way that I relate with people in my life, whether that be friends or family. And I would construct really different pitches and pitch lists from that simple question of, okay, how has tarot been most useful for me? What's my tarot story?
Yeah, I love that so much. I'm already seeing the bullet list that's like, how tarot helped me overcome fear and start a successful business, or how tarot helped me reunite with my family. Ugh, talking to myself. Or, how tarot reignited my creative practice after a 5-year slump. Like, there's so many ways that we can take sort of those seeds of inspiration you gave us, and for me, like, flip it into a really concise bullet point pitch topic, or really, like, I would even use those as podcast episode titles, which is so helpful for me as a host. If I get a pitch and I'm like, great, you wrote the title for me, like, thank you. It makes me want to say yes to us having a conversation. I think the last thing I'll highlight there, which you were also saying, is like, I would not put all of those pitch ideas in the same email to one podcast. Those are different types of podcasts, right? Like, you're not going to come on Off the Grid to talk about family dynamics and issues, but you might come on to talk about using tarot to start a business, right? So like, you will have these different shapes of your pitch for different podcasts.
Yeah. And I would really, I think for a lot of reasons, trying to only have 1 or 2, maybe 3, if you have a lot of capacity, core audiences, and a different list and pitch for all of them. And what I appreciate too about asking those types of questions for yourself is tarot is so broad. We could take that in a million directions. And so it goes back to the specificity. Who do I want to talk to right now? who is my business best equipped to support right now? And what can I share that's going to connect with that person? That's going to make the person that I love to read for press play on that episode.
Take it to the ideal client. Take it to the ideal listener. Yes. Okay, let's try another example. Let's pretend that we are career coaches and we support mid-career professionals, particularly in like tech and corporate settings. And we want to do podcast guesting because we need some new clients for our coaching practice. Where do we go from here, Taylor? How do we start crafting our pitch topics and pitch list?
Yeah. And this is a good one because I feel like this can happen in a lot of places, but it's so easy to be like, I work with people in tech, so I need to go on tech podcasts, which maybe they are listening to a tech podcast, but maybe like what other things are those people interested in? So if you're looking at people in tech, they probably live near larger cities, even though that's starting to change more. What are the types of hobbies that they're interested in? What, like, really looking holistically at their life. Also, if they're mid-career, are they parents? Are there certain questions that they're starting to ask? And so leaning in on looking at them holistically and leaning into a specific problem. If they're a mid-career professional, it could be that they are considering pivoting their career. There's been so many layoffs in tech. You might do a whole talk track of how to pivot out of tech and how your tech experience is transferable elsewhere. It could be that they really want to get promoted. So you might talk about, here are the jobs that are going to be the biggest jobs in tech. Here's how to translate your experience to get promoted. Maybe they're working now in like a global environment, or they're trying to figure out how to engage with Gen Z. You could have a whole talk track that is related to navigating multicultural or a multi-generational environment in tech. And again, you're going to choose these topics based on what you think is going to be valuable to the listener, but also who do you like to coach? If you don't like to coach parents because you're not a parent, then don't add that as one of the things you want to talk about.
Yeah. Oh, you are so brilliant. I just need to say this out loud. Like, as I come up with these examples, I'm like, oh, thank God Taylor's here to answer these questions I'm coming up with. I love this so much. And it's also reminding me, like, it's a sort of different way of answering what do I pitch, right? So with the tarot reader, we were like, what if you look to your personal background and how do you shape that into pitch topics? How has tarot helped you? How can that become a pitch? With this example, we're looking to like, what are the problems that your ideal client is having and how do you speak directly to those? And so that's a different way to approach, like, how do I build my pitch list in this instance? And I love this. And it gives us a lot of different ideas and options. Let's do one more example. Let's say I run a super cute stationery shop in Chicago. Now I'm just like putting my future dreams out there. And I want to do some podcast guesting because I like talking about what I do. And I just think like conversations are a great way for me to put myself and my business out there. How might you build a pitch list for this person? And I think I have a question of like, is podcast guesting for me? And how might I build like a pitch list for this business?
Yeah. My immediate question was, do you have e-commerce? Because that makes a big difference. If you do have e-commerce, then you might have a broader pitch list. Otherwise, you're probably going to focus on people who are specifically talking about Chicago. Immediately, some ideas that came to mind, we were talking about like letter writing and connection. I even wonder if there's a play for talking about the loneliness epidemic and how people are so lonely and how practices like writing letters could lead to connection. There's also really cool nonprofits who do work of writing letters to the elderly, writing letters to folks who are incarcerated. And so there might be ways to weave that story in. And I just leaned into letter writing. Maybe that's not what this person particularly is excited about, but the theme that I'm tapping into is this idea of loneliness and connection that is ubiquitous in our society right now, and how what you're talking about might weave into that. The other way that I might approach it, depending on what this shop owner is trying to do, is maybe they want to write a book about stationery, or maybe they want to be seen as some type of business expert. They want to start consulting other people on how to build their retail stores. Then that's a different approach. I probably would focus more on telling the story of how I've had the shop for 5 years, 10 years, however long, what I do to get people in the door, what I do to create an unforgettable experience. So, two different approaches depending on if I want to funnel people into buying product or if I want to funnel people into specifically seeing me as an expert. And I think that's a good consideration because your first two examples were more solopreneurs. When you have a business with a product and with a team, you do have to ask yourself, am I trying to build up my own personal brand, even though I'm iffy on that language of personal brand now? Or am I trying to build up my company? Or a mixture of both?
Yes, that's so wise and something that I feel like has come up a lot for me, even as I think about like podcast guesting and what I talk about, because I have two very distinct lanes. Like one lane is podcast about podcasting, and I will get invited to talk about different aspects of podcasting. And there I'm really kind of showing up as like the founder of Softer Sounds. And I really talk more about this like area of expertise than I do about my personal experience. And then I also have like everything to do with business without social media and off the grid. And in that capacity, I'm showing up much more as like Amelia, who is also the host of Off the Grid, than I am like kind of putting the business in the foreground. So I think this is really interesting. And like, thank you for that sort of example of like different ways that we could use podcast guesting to just establish just different messaging opportunities for our business and to grow in different ways, and deciding, are we focusing on guesting for the sake of getting more clients or customers in the door of the stationery shop that I just invented? Or are we focusing on establishing our expertise as a business owner who's been running this imaginary stationery shop for a decade? Because those are very different types of podcasts, very different pitch lists, very different things to talk about. So I think that at this point, with these examples, we've kind of shown that no matter what type of business you run, I think there is an opportunity for you to grow through podcast guesting. If you're approaching it with that specificity, to use your keyword, Taylor, of knowing like who do you want to reach and how are you trying to grow? What specifically do you want to grow? How much do you want to grow it? Who do you need to be in front of to help make that happen? So hopefully, folks have lots of ideas. I can feel my body like buzzing. The energy is percolating around podcast guesting. I could probably go like write a bunch of pitches right now. But I also know that you have created a whole entire course about this that I also have contributed to. And I'd love to invite you to talk about this course. So could you tell us a little bit more about it and what it offers to people and how they can learn about it and take it?
Definitely. So podcast guesting and being a guest on podcast was something that I started doing when I first launched my company, Inner Workout, and have done it to varying degrees ever since, including like I paid a PR firm thousands of dollars to help me podcast guest during my book launch when I had a bunch of other stuff going on. So it's something that I've got years of experience with. And I just realized it's a way to be able to help people. And I don't really like to gatekeep, but I also don't like to waste my energy. So it got to a certain point where I was like, let me just put this all of this information into a course. Let me ask Amelia to bring some of her podcasting expertise into it. And it ended up what I'm calling a mini course, but it's actually got a lot in there. It's got like 18 modules, I think, of how to grow your brand by podcast guesting, which is the name of the course. And so there's 3 modules with different frameworks within it. The first is all about positioning yourself as a strategist. So we've heard some of this, the different ways that you can position yourself depending on who you're trying to talk to. And so there's content in there on writing your bio, figuring out who you're talking to, how to showcase your expertise, how to write a pitch. And Amelia and I actually gathered real pitches that we've got in our inbox, and I recorded a whole video doing teardowns, what worked about the pitches, what didn't work about the pitches. I really feel like I tapped into my mean reality show judge energy, even though I wasn't that mean, but it was more critical than I normally am. And then it also has a template for building a media kit. And then the second piece is how to pitch like an agency. So how to create the structure of building your list. I share the tool that I use to find different podcasts to be on that whenever I tell people about, they're like, I did not know you could use it in this way. And I share like 3 different ways to use that tool. And then the last module is become every host favorite guest. And that's really where Amelia came in as the expert guest to talk about how can you technically, linguistically, preparationally show up as a guest that people are impressed with and who are happy to recommend you to be on other people's podcasts as well. So position yourself like a strategist, pitch like an agency, and become every podcast host's favorite guest are the 3 modules. And then there's like 18 lessons, and you get a pitch list database template in Notion and in Sheets. And then you also get a media kit template in Notion.
Yes. And there is a giant PDF workbook that you created that is fantastic. And for the folks who are like, I love an online course, but I need to write everything down, it is definitely your best friend. I love the workbook. It's great. I also really appreciated when you invited me into this course to talk about being a host's favorite guest, because I think that often when I hear people talk about podcast guesting, they're really talking about everything that comes up to the interview. And then they just kind of drop you there. And they're like, great, I just trust that you know how to do this from the get-go. And you'll be a great interviewee and you'll have great tech and everything will sound good. And we also need instruction in that part. My favorite guests are the ones who come with mics. They come ready to know what to talk about. They have good Wi-Fi. There are a lot of things that go into being a great guest as well. And so I was really happy to contribute that piece of the course, both around what is a very low cost technical setup you can have for podcasting that'll make you sound great for the shows you're on? And then also, what are some of the things you can do before, during, and after just to be a great guest? And for exactly the reasons you mentioned, so that the host will be thrilled and tell all the other podcasters they know that they should have you on their show. And, I can speak firsthand from the end of last year being on the biggest podcast I've ever been on, that it's one thing to get the invite and it's another thing to ace the interview. And it's that matters so much. It's somebody opened the door for you, but how you step into that room and your presence once you're in there is really important. So I appreciate that there's a bit of all of that in this course. And I was so thrilled to contribute to it. And if you, dear listener, are now okay, Taylor and Amelia, I'm ready to go be a guest on podcasts, I'm stepping into this for 2025. I hope that you'll go get the course, and you can use the code OFFTHEGRID, one word, all caps, to take $50 off until the end of the month. So if 2025 is your year of being a guest on podcasts, use the code OFFTHEGRID, head to the link in the show notes, get the course. And honestly, I can't wait to get your pitch. Put me on your list. Send it my way. I can't promise you'll all be on the podcast, obviously, but I'd love to hear from you, because pitches are also a fun way where I learn about other people's work. Even if they don't end up being on the show, now I know more about what they do, and that's fun. And I file it away for the future, and who knows what that turns into down the line. Is there anything else that you would like to say about podcast guesting, about the course, or really just about business more broadly as we sign off today?
Yeah. The last thing that I want to add, regardless of whether or not you buy the course, we mentioned one blog post already. I wrote a second blog post about how to make sure you're making the most of being a guest on podcasts. So even if you decide to DIY this without the course, I recommend that you read that blog post, because it's so much more, to Amelia's point, it's so much more than just getting on the podcast. It's knowing what to do with these new people and these new relationships that you're nurturing with. And like I said, I don't like to gatekeep. And so check out that blog post and make sure that you are ready to deal with the new people and relationships that are coming your way if you decide to use podcast guesting as part of your marketing strategy.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really feel like this episode has set people up to not just kind of haphazardly be a guest on a podcast or two next year, but very intentionally work this into their marketing ecosystem and the strategies they're choosing to focus on in 2025. So thank you, Taylor, for bringing us all of this wisdom. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to this episode. Gotta say, like podcast guesting and email marketing, which we talked about in yesterday's episode with Ali, these two strategies go very well together for growing and nurturing and selling to your community in 2025 and beyond. So I hope that this has been helpful and supportive. Tomorrow, I will be back in your earbuds with a conversation about relationship marketing, which I really think just like brings all of this together. And I can't wait to share it with you. So until next time, we will see you off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go